So today we welcome, as you know, Simon Conway Morris, who's held the chair in evolutionary paleobiology in the Earth Sciences Department since 1995 and has made many seminal discoveries in the area of evolutionary biology, including actually a paper in Science just a few weeks ago, in case you missed that one, but is published very widely in Nature and Cell and Science and many other journals over the years. And he is the author of a book that I'm sure many of us here have already read, Life Solution, Inevitable Humans in a Lonely Universe. And I was browsing in Heifers a few days ago and noticed it's now in paperback, so if you haven't got it yet, there's absolutely no excuse. I do warmly recommend Simon's book to you. But in fact, today Simon is going to, I think, cover a little bit of what's in that book, but also take us on, as it were, to the next stage of reflection of some of the issues which arise from the same theme. And so his title for us today is If the Evolution of Intelligence is Inevitable, What Are the Theological Implications? So thank you, Simon.
Thank you very much, Dennis, and good afternoon. Thank you very much for giving up your lunchtime to hear me witter on. This is a typical sort of Cambridge talk, in as much as, first of all, I almost certainly won't talk about the title. Second of all, I'll actually talk about, or I shall use an existing talk in a manner of speaking, and then right at the end, perhaps try and see if we can empty this room in under 2 minutes with a number of peculiar suggestions which are intriguing me at the moment. Whether you're persuaded remains to be seen, but they are so mad as to be absolutely ridiculous, so I'm quite encouraged in that area. What I will do, though, is go through the talk, if you like, which, as Dennis mentioned, is largely based on this book, Life Solution. You'll get a plug for that properly in a couple of minutes. But I'm going to go very, very quickly indeed. Obviously, a good number of you here are scientists, and if there's discussion on particular areas which you think are open to controversy, I'm more than happy to defend my views as best I can. But I'm not here really to sort of explain the background of the science. We'll just rattle through that as quickly as possible. I'll try and get through in half an hour. And then, as I say, I'll try and unhinge you all for 10 minutes if I can. It may not be too difficult, in fact. And then, with luck, we'll have a bit of discussion after that. So I shall proceed as quickly as I can. And again, I know at least one distinguished astronomer here. There are probably more than that. But of course, the fact of the matter is that science is not only an open-ended enterprise. In fact, I regard it as infinitely open-ended. The idea there's a theory of everything, I just think, is highly improbable. And that's something which might have some reflection on the universe we live in, conceivably so. And certainly as a geologist, I'm well informed after a fashion about our history of the own planet and the solar system. And as most of you will now know, more than 150 extra solar planets have been discovered. It's not likely any have life on them because they're mostly too large, at least according to our present expectations. But even so, the likelihood is that if we don't find some signals in the next 40 years, and as Frank Drake, the person who devised the so-called Drake equation, roughly how many civilizations are there out there, then, as he said, and I think this is not off the record, we give up. So there's a very interesting time, the next 40 years. We may really know some things forever, perhaps. And as I say, going on very quickly indeed, to be justified with pleasure, but first of all we would argue that biochemistry, in terms of such things as proteins, carbon-based even, water as the universal solvent, and even such things as DNA may well be universals. There is some reason to think actually the number of alternatives, although in principle could be very large, in reality may be far more restricted than is often thought to be the case. However, as all of you will know, especially if you read the work of, say, Steve Jay Gould, most famously, but most other neo-Darwinians, and if there's any residual doubt here, I am a neo-Darwinian, so okay, we must get that straight immediately. But I wouldn't agree with everything which some of my distinguished colleagues say, because Gould and Diamond and Simpson and many others have suggested that evolution, at least in terms of outcomes of complexity, animals, plants, mushrooms, the sorts of things which divide life into these 5 or 6 major groups, are completely haunted by contingent events. Mass extinctions is the one Gould was most interested in, but one can imagine many other accidents. And of course the emphasis in evolution on randomness, especially mutation, again is some reason to think that really almost any outcome is equally probable or improbable. And so here we see the gentleman in his underpants, the idea that in his brain he's got an evolutionary end product called intelligence would be largely regarded as a complete and utter fluke. In parenthesis, what that suggests is, if correct, and I don't think it is, and I'll try and persuade you why it's not correct, then in fact the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, which as other people have pointed out, is far more interesting from a theological point of view than a scientific viewpoint, is a complete and utter waste of time. Now, in the case of especially history, the interest in counterfactuals, and there are a whole set of these volumes, this is one of the better known ones, edited by Robert Cowley, called What If?, effectively saying, well, supposing we were to rerun the tape of history, how might things be different? One of my favourite areas of interest, of course, is to imagine what would have happened if, for instance, Hermann Goering had continued his attack on the English airfields rather than diverting his attention to the English cities. I quite like this slide for a number of reasons. It says a whole lot about this country, which we've been quietly kicking in the teeth for some 20 years. But it has another thing here, this famous quote from Churchill, of course, never I show much, I show many to show few. And these jokers here, the joke in the mess is, so they must have been talking about our bar bills, but but as Dennis very kindly mentioned, there are other views on this, and I'm particularly interested in the phenomena of evolutionary convergence, which I think may indicate that there's a deeper pattern to biological evolution, and if that's the case, that's fine and large. But in a certain sort of way, I would hope as a scientist we would be entirely unsurprised by this, because after all, chemists use the periodic table, and physicists use the theory of gravity and relativity and those sorts of things. So is it really the case that evolution is almost completely open-ended? But the paradox in the subtitle is that, funnily enough, I think we're completely alone. And again, that has a theological implication, I'm fully aware of that. And again, it's testable. You know, if it turns out to be different, that's fine. We can make a new set of assumptions. One aspect just worth dwelling on very, very briefly, and I'll come back to the evolutionary eye very quickly, is that there has been an idea, if you like, that for all intents and purposes, life is very common, but it will remain, if you like, in a microbial rut, what the Americans call palm scum. In other words, producing complex things, such as brains and eyes and all those sorts of things, actually is rather difficult. And this is linked to a hypothesis known as the rare earth, which effectively says we are on a very, very special planet. You have to say, looking out in this beautiful part of the world today, it does look rather special. That may be true, but what we can show, I think, is that most of the things which underpin complex forms, such as the eye, have evolved long, long before their eyes. In the particular case of the eye, we have the opsins at the back to transduce the light into electricity, approximately. And we have a transparency conferred by these proteins known as crystallins. Those two have evolved long, long before their eyes. So I'd be surprised myself if there's so many hurdles to complex forms emerging. But this is something which, again, is a matter of controversy. There's no doubt about that. Now, such examples of convergence are epitomised in a way with one of the most famous examples, which deals with these saber-toothed cats. And very briefly, this is a well-known story now, thanks in fact to some American paleobiologists, but we have two saber-toothed cats which are really quite similar. There's only one interesting difference between one of them. They're both extinct. This one living in South America actually is a marsupial, therefore it's pretty closely related to a wombat. And this one is placental, that's related to ourselves, cows, giraffes and moles. So in other words, this cat's closer to a hedgehog and this cat's closer to a wombat than they are to each other. But I think you'll agree that to the first approximation, the similarity is quite striking. People keep on saying, well, you know, Simon, you really should grow up, you know, should realise there are significant differences, not only in terms of reproduction, but the postcranial skeleton. And my reply to that, very approximately, is, well, I don't really care. Because frankly, I think it's completely academic whether you're eaten by this cat or by this cat. Horrible experience. Now, one area which is thought to be largely immune to molecular convergence is is molecular convergence. And I just want to give you one such example. The reason why it's thought to be immune is fairly straightforward. We have a very large number of alternatives. If you have 20 amino acids to build a protein, sometimes 21, 22 perhaps, and you have a typical protein of maybe 500 amino acids, then the number of alternatives is astronomically large. But it turns out, in fact, that there's some very intriguing examples of convergence. Again, I'll just mention one. Carbon-based life will have to deal with carbon dioxide. Now, carbon dioxide is a wretched molecule because it's rather refractory. It's got strong ionic bonds and it's difficult to break. In photosynthesis, in respiration, in biomineralization, anything involving the dealing with carbon dioxide, and especially the hydration of carbon dioxide, what one uses is something called carbonic anhydrase. And it turns out that carbonic anhydrase is an active site with the zinc and 3 amino acids, normally histidines. The point about the carbonic anhydrase is it's evolved independently, not once, twice, 3 times as shown here, but actually at least 5 times. And my view now is that wherever you are in the universe, if it's carbon-based life form, I think you can bet yourself it's going to be using carbonic anhydrase. So that's a sort of predictability to things which has been neglected, perhaps, from some aspects of neo-Darwinism. the idea that intelligence might have theological implications, which I think it does, must be rooted really, I think, in the evolution of the nervous systems. And I want to canter through that also extremely quickly before we move on to parallel examples of intelligence in about 10 minutes' time. And when we look at the evolution of the eye, of course, Richard Dawkins, amongst others, have written very eloquently about this, and this is something which Darwin himself was very concerned about. I should also say this is a rather splendid slide, and very unworthily I call it my head of department slide. The old man play, and I'm not sure if it's visible to you with this light. There's a little wreck at the back as well, which is quite fun. But the point, of course, about the camera eye in particular is famously it is convergent between the cephalopods, the squid, the octopus, and ourselves. We're closely related to starfish, they're closely related to oysters, and again, I can happily justify this if necessary in discussion. But the degree of convergence between these two types is very, very striking indeed. But more importantly, this camera eye, although of course there are differences, and that's why evolution is true, this is what just a simple argument we have with the creationists who want an argument in this area, I don't think it's worth having the argument at all, is that such an eye has evolved independently probably 7 times, and there's an interesting correlation between that sort of eye and the fact that the animals concerned typically tend to move rather quickly, they tend to be perpetually hungry because they're carnivores, and they tend towards intelligence, which is an interesting predisposition perhaps to being an astronomer, for example. Correspondingly, there are alternative eyes. Actually, there are many sorts of eyes, but the compound eye is the main one on the block. The compound eye has some design limitations in comparison with the camera eye, although in a certain sense it's a very elegant design. Effectively, it is less capable of gathering as much light as a camera eye. And a famous thought experiment by Kuhn and Kirschfeld simply said that if we were to be equipped with the compound eye rather than the camera eye, the sort of eye which we would require to be able to enjoy the view of the heavens, if you like, is depressingly large. In fact, Kirschfeld suggests that the eye would probably be in the order of around about 10 meters across. So that again suggests compound eyes, because they've evolved independently at least 4 times, will also be found on other planets, if there are any planets with eyes on them at all. But nevertheless, I think they'll be in insectoid-like forms, not in astronomers, as it so happens. Now, these areas of sensory perception, again, I'll go through this extremely quickly, though all of them, I think, individually are totally fascinating, are important because I think it has a bearing on the universality of mentalities, assuming that in some way the roots of consciousness and sentience involve sensory processing. Perhaps that's wrong. So in the famous star-nosed mole, an American species here, although it has olfactory abilities, these highly prehensile and highly tactile tentacles are being shown to effectively work in terms of neurobiology in the same way as an eye. The whole wiring of the thing suggests that although indeed it's touch, it's possible that within the brain of this mole, actually the image it is forming through touch in some ways is strangely similar to the way we use our eyes to see. There's a fundamental identity there. Correspondingly, in more alien sorts of sensory perception, especially electrical fields generated by a large number of fish, and again there are wonderful examples of convergence here too. There is evidence that although indeed this is an elephant-nosed fish, a Mormarid from Africa, has an eye, it's not a terribly good eye, it's fairly weak. The electrical world this animal lives in, once again, is leading to something which, for all intents and purposes, is remarkably similar to the way that we see. There's even a suggestion that, in a manner of speaking, they see, even using an analogue of colour, through the distortion of the electrical fields by which they are generated and then received by these areas. Now, why does all this matter? It matters because I think the argument by Thomas Nagel about the mind of a bat being forever close to us, in other words, being an entirely alien environment, may not be true. It may be that however you choose to process sensory information, be it by echolocation, famously in the bat, famously also convergent, be it by touch, be it by electrical fields, there is a deep identity of common mental processes there. Now, if that is true here, conceivably that is true everywhere else, and that again obviously has, I think, a theological implication to it. One has a certain sort of nervous system which is predisposed to making sense of the world around it. However, inevitable humans, imagine that we're now 100 light years from the Earth, we open the hatch and we see this, we would, sorry, not we were meant to see that, if we see this, then we would be sort of, I think a little bit surprised. And one of the reasons, going back to Gould's arguments, are, as I like to label this particular slide, the degree ceremony in Oxford. You see all these dinosaurs? Oh, wonderful. Is, of course, that some clown dropped a large rock on the planet 65 million years ago, on a June day, if you're interested, There's good evidence for that, as I say, a very clever piece of paleobotanical work as it happened. And this led to the demise of the dinosaurs, and I think, although directly it wasn't responsible, nevertheless the ecologists were so perturbed by this colossal impact that the great reptiles, not only the dinosaurs, but the flying reptiles and the marine reptiles went extinct. But Gould's argument, of course, was that if that was the case, if the asteroid had missed, in other words, and the dinosaurs had proceeded to the present day, then our history simply wouldn't happen. It's like that Battle of Britain, the counterfactual. So, as he points out, we wouldn't have the mind of a bat because there wouldn't be any bats. There wouldn't be any cetaceans, there wouldn't be any whales, and I'll explain very quickly in a moment. Of course, these are very interesting as examples of, if you like, an alternative intelligence. And correspondingly, of course, as he emphasised many, many times, there wouldn't be any primates, so there wouldn't be any great apes, so again, there wouldn't be us. Now, all this is absolutely true historically. I don't think there's any particular dispute about that. There are some nuances in exactly when the mammals began to radiate, involving arguments to do with molecular clocks and so forth, but for the first approximation, I'm sure that's correct. However, I think in the longish term, it makes no difference at all. And the reason for that is that planets like the Earth, with carbon dioxide, with plate tectonics, and with oceans, cannot avoid going into ice ages. And again, there's wonderful stories to be told about snowball Earth and all those sorts of things. What happens in the counterfactual Earth where the asteroid misses, but the ice ages still happen, because they have nothing to do with impacts at all? Effectively, I think what we would see is that the temperate and polar zones would be much more favourable to those animals which coexisted with the dinosaurs but were warm-blooded. They're called mammals and birds. They would then take the ecological opportunity to radiate in these more demanding environments. The tropics remain full of dinosaurs until a bird, as I'll show you in a moment, or a mammal, invents a spear, which I think is inevitable, and then the mass extinction of the dinosaurs begins. So mass extinctions may accelerate things. I think they did. They might even postpone them, but my view is they never cancel them. And it's when we look especially at the birds that we see some very, very intriguing examples of convergence. Much more intriguing, I think, than has been widely realised. And this is manifested in a number of different ways. For example, if we look at the warm-bloodedness, which presumably is a necessary prerequisite for a stable brain state, which again might be necessary for worship. For example, do dinosaurs worship? Probably not, as it so happens. But this is a slightly improbable photograph. It looks a bit like Thetford, but in point of fact where you have horses and penguins in the same view. This is, of course, the dear old Falkland Islands. Oh, yes, indeed. And the warm-bloodedness of the birds, including, of course, the penguins and the mammals, is independent of each other. They have separate origins. Correspondingly, there's some very interesting work which I'll touch on in a moment with regards to vocalizations and singing, but the neurobiology of vocalization and the way in which many birds learn to sing have striking parallels with the mammals, and that too is convergent. And again, if one decides what exactly mental states involve which enable people to sing, and what that means to most of us, then there too one perhaps gets the first hint that there are deeper matters being involved here than simply defending your territory from hostile competitors. Most interesting are two other things. First, it turns out, especially in some parrots, parakeets and also crows, that they are very playful. Playfulness, again, socially is extremely important, especially amongst the young, because it's a way, in fact, you sort of discover your environment in a more interesting way. But you can categorise play, and this is not a boring way of categorising it. There are actually different ways in which you can recognise the various tugging and fooling around and showing off and the like. And there are striking parallels, once again, between the birds and the mammals in this regard. Again, they are strikingly convergent. Again, I can give you all the examples, but I don't want to detain that. I just want to emphasise this fact of convergence, which has only really appeared in a coherent way in the last 10 years, or perhaps for 5 years. And especially you look at the New Zealand kea, for example, very interesting parrot. They are very sort of adventurous in many sorts of ways. In fact, the juveniles go around they go around in gangs and go around trashing things. But the most remarkable results are those both done in Oxford with Kozelnik's group, and also people in New Zealand, Grey and Hunt in particular, which have shown that the tool-making abilities of the crows, famously the New Caledonian crow, but generally as a group showing remarkable intelligence, the New Caledonian crow has tool-making abilities which seem to far outstrip what we see in the chimpanzee, both in their ability to think through particular problems. And people sometimes make a sort of fuss about this and they sort of say, well, come on, it's all very interesting. Yes, they actually have effectively a series of building tools in different ways for different functions, and actually to get from one to the other, you've got to do things in a progressive set of precisely orientated steps. I think this can be legitimately called a proto-technology. Even so, is this really the same as what we are accustomed with? Well, my answer to that is just say, well, let's go back 2 million years and sort of compare the sort of tools we were making at that stage with what these animals are making at the present day. And I'm not persuaded there's such a difference. And again, Nicky Clayton in particular in this university has made some startling progress in terms of working towards a theory of mind. She's very cautious about this, and rightly so, because that's a bit of a graveyard of ambitions. But it does seem to be more likely than ever that these animals do have a theory of mind, and that shouldn't surprise us. But of course it's convergent. And why this is so important is that if you look at the structure of the bird brain, which generally is regarded as ludicrously small and inadequate, first of all it's not, but more importantly its entire structure is really built on a radically different design to the mammals. Yet despite that, effectively you have the same mental architecture, the same cognitive landscape emerging. This is taken from one of Nicky's papers in Science, published a couple of years ago. Again, I don't have time to go into all the gory details, but she would argue, and I very much agree with it, not only because I want to, but I think the evidence is genuinely convincing, that the sort of aspects which lead eventually to a complex cognition, be it in a crow or a chimpanzee, are remarkably similar. But there is a limitation in certain ways in terms of their flexibility of limbs, if you like. They can use their feet for all sorts of ingenious things, but nevertheless they are effectively, in a sense, trapped with their wings. And also, they have some parallels between ourselves, in as much as we had ancestors living in trees. And you might say, well, maybe there's some ecological parallels there. And in particular, though there is a correlation between brain size and intelligence in birds, it's not as precise as you might expect, certainly amongst the most intelligent birds. When we look at the humans again, Gould made a great song and dance about this, because when he was arguing for the contingencies of histories, the accidents of histories, the spandrels as he referred to them, the sort of things which may have happened for one reason, thereby, so if you're wandering around 4 million years ago as an Australopithecine, or even Homo erectus, and indeed I don't have the slides here to persuade you, but there's some reasonable evidence that Homo erectus, at least for its early history, did not have a language. There are 2 good lines of evidence for that, I think. And then ourselves here, where of course we have this sort of gigantic brain which is capable of algebra and composing music. But Gould would argue repeatedly, this is just a fluke, sure, it may lead into social circumstances which require the dynamic of, say, religious dialogue, to take an example of interest to many people here, I imagine. But these things are just an offshoot which are neither, in the grand scheme of things, here or there. Well, in this case of increase in brain size, there is again a very interesting parallel, because if we look at the cognitive world of, and I've chosen a particularly magnificent primate here for your comparison, and also the cetaceans, especially the dolphins, once again we see very, very striking parallels between these. And in some ways this is more useful as an example of convergence, in as much as though they're, to be sure, both mammals, the brain structure of the dolphins really is pretty different in many, many aspects, but more importantly, because they live in an ocean, their echolocation, there's those sorts of things. So you might expect a different cognitive architecture to emerge. I'll skip that one because it's not too material to this argument. And indeed, although just appeared in Biological Reviews, is a very much sort of contrarian paper to explain the origin of brain size in dolphins and the other whales in terms of water temperature, work by Laurie Marino and Louis Herman and others do persuade us, although captured in a sense by the playfulness, and they like to blow through the air hole here, these bubbles which then form into these rings as a consequence of the pressure of the water, which they enjoy playing around with. Their ability to recognize themselves in mirrors, their ability to deal with simple instructions in a syntactical and semantic way, do suggest to many people, along with a series of other sort of effectively psychological tests, that not only are these animals very smart indeed, but some people would suggest they're actually smarter than chimpanzee, but have emerged effectively convergently. Moving swiftly on. And this is something which I'll try and come back to in the last 10 minutes, as I promised, because there is this problem which I think is very largely unsolved, because despite all that, the fact is, there's no other species so far as we know, not even the termites, who have a lecture around about 1 o'clock after a good lunch. Thank you very much. Or to put it in a more sort of ridiculous way, what other species would think this is a sensible thing to do? There is something extra about us now, which is, I think there's perfectly good scientific explanations about this, but nevertheless I think it is a stumbling block which we shouldn't shy away from. however animal-like we might be, once we've entered this new world, then all bets are off. But it's been suggested that this is just a one-off. It didn't happen any other time. But there are some interesting parallels, especially with the Neanderthals. This being a Neanderthal skull here, this being Homo sapiens. I'm taking Neanderthals as a separate species, mostly on the evidence of the ancient DNA, but also the osteology. This is a very controversial area. And of course the Neanderthals are extinct, disappearing maybe 30,000 years ago, depending on whose radiocarbon dating you're believing. Paul Mellers has published very recently on this, a very important paper indeed. And you can also say, well, look, whatever I'm going to tell you, does it really matter? Because after all, we are closely related, though our ancestry may actually diverge more than 700,000 years ago. But I think really underlying this is the sense, as perhaps the New Caledonian crows also hint, is as you get to certain levels of complexity, things which from an Archean viewpoint, that is 4 billion years ago when there were only bacteria, would seem ridiculous, effectively become increasingly likely and over geological time. And that's maybe why we do need geological time, for any, apart from any other reason, for these things to emerge. So in the case of the Neanderthals, what's so fascinating about them is that they had fire, they had almost certainly clothing, but they also, intriguingly, on occasion buried their dead. This is the famous Kabara burial here, and there's a little bit of evidence from Shanidar in Iraq that perhaps they used flowers. I think the evidence is it's weak. I don't think it's particularly convincing. Now, there may be a whole set of reasons why you choose to use inhumation, to use a technical term, but that in its own way it's a sort of tantalizing thought. Even more tantalizing is the real possibility that their late-stage efflorescence, the so-called Chano-Peronian cultures and analogous ones elsewhere in Europe, long thought to be effectively the result of imitation, possibly trading, but in other respects probably copying, in point of fact may have evolved completely independently. So here we have a series of incised and bored teeth and bones, and also a punch here, which of course weren't found like this, but they can be reasonably reconstructed as some necklace or at least body ornament. And of course once you've got to that sort of stage, and you can say, well, bowerbirds in a certain sort of way are perhaps going in that direction, but once you've got to that way where you've got an external symbolic reference, and of course you can immediately think of how important that is in all sorts of discourse, I mean famously sexual of course, but also theological in many aspects, and depending. No doubt there's some good Quakers here who enjoy the utmost simplicity, but I'm afraid I'm very much in the other direction every time I go into an Italian church. Bow! Terrific stuff, but there we go. Maybe the roots of that are actually in the Chano-Peronian culture. And if it is independent, and this is controversial certainly, then there's intriguing possibility that that too is something which is going to emerge through the evolutionary processes. Now obviously the details of the cognitive world, the argument whether Neanderthals were capable of shamanism, things like that, of course, are ones which probably attract more science fiction writers than actually science themselves, but I'm not saying that they're necessarily foolish conjectures in their own way. So, what intrigues me about Darwinism in a funny sort of way is that it sort of is being fantastically successful and fantastically informative, and with respect to the evolutionary program, it has many unsolved problems, but I don't think any of us actually think we're completely on the wrong track, and again that's why I would certainly draw severe issue with anybody who subscribes to anything which would be called scientific creationism. I just think, on the record it's total rubbish, and I think they're doing themselves and others a great disservice as it happens. But I wonder whether our appreciation of Darwin in particular is quite as complete as it might be, which would seem a very arrogant thing to say, but it really goes back to this question of the contingencies and the outcomes, which are thought to be, for the most part, very unpredictable. And I'll just dwell on a few things before finishing. As already hinted, or more than hinted, it seems to me that we seriously underestimate the mental state of many animals, and right at the end I'll come back to this question of how deep these mental states might actually go. It's open talking to dog owners like myself, or cat owners. I believe there are some who would argue that these dogs and cats have emotional lives, but I think most of us feel that they do. And indeed, I think this has serious issues in terms of just the ethics of how you choose to rear animals. I'm not a vegetarian, some of you may have seen having a great chunk of chicken, but even and we have chicken, Mrs. Conway Morris has chicken, so let's get this right. I don't think they're quite as brainy as my dog, but nevertheless, there are aspects about their happiness which I think we neglect, perhaps at our peril in the long term, but they're not ones which we should simply shunt under the side for the reasons of the profits of a well-known supermarket, which I'm not mentioning because I don't want to go to court. Another thing which is very interesting indeed, and this is very controversial because this week or last week science has taken the story perhaps further, perhaps not, which is then going towards this question of what the roots of our mentality might be, is that the Indian, of course, you know, these unhappy people here in Java just this week in a tectonically extremely active area, any case with the trench here and the volcanoes and the standard geological story, which is fascinating in its own respect, not to mention the odd tsunami and everything else. Some of which, by the way, will hit Australia. They did in the past and they will in the future, which is worth remembering. But this is a rich archaeological and anthropological zone, famous for Homo erectus, Java man, for example, and also Homo sapiens itself. But of course, on the island of Flores, as many of you will know, this extraordinary finds were cropped up just about 2 years ago. And what's so fascinating about these things is this is an adult skull, but it's got a brain size of a chimpanzee, and held here by a representative of our own species. Now, these things have been perhaps rather unfortunately labelled hobbits, which is most unfortunate in many, many respects. But the arguments are that these things were capable hunters, and that they had full cognitive abilities. Now, if you look in this week's Science, in this country, last week's in the States, there has been a recurrent suggestion that these are effectively a version of microcephalics, that these are dwarfs or something like that they don't have generally sort of diminished brains. But their osteology in particular is far more similar to Homo erectus than it is to anything in Homo sapiens, and there's a vigorous debate going on at the moment. And there's a very important paper published 18 months ago by Dean Falk and others, looking at the endocast of this so-called hobbit, Homo florensis, and arguing that indeed it has various lobes which are consistent with higher cognitive processes. But it does beg the question, of course, that if that really is the case, and this is very much open for debate, this is science, then where exactly does its sort of mental capacities lie? I mean, how do you make a brain so small and yet apparently still retain a sort of, how does one put it? One struggles almost for words, but you know, one understands a consciousness which allows one to hunt, to make fire, and effectively to evolve as humans. Oops, that's gone. There we go. And where this becomes also interesting in another sort of respect is to do with singing. Now, I've referred to that with respect to the birds. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead one and then back one. This is a paper which appeared in Biological Letters. It's a bird which lives in South America, and bird singing is well known in terms of general audition, but in the tropics you quite often get this thing called duetting, where two birds will sing together. These guys have got it absolutely incredibly. These ones actually have an antiphony where up to 7 birds can sing totally in synchrony. Now, I don't have my notes with me, I can't remember whether the red are the females and the blue are the males. I think it's that way around. But what we have here is an incredible example of antiphonal singing, whereby they come in perfectly, alternating this song, which can go on for up to 2 minutes, and one bird can actually drop in here, join in perfectly, and leave again during the middle of this antiphonal discourse, and then join again. And it's rather unfair of the experimenters, because what they did is they recorded these birds and then played them through loudspeakers. So all the birds said, "What's going on? Who's singing out there?" They'd all stand in front of the loudspeaker like that. Of course, they all had rings on them, so they knew who was doing the singing. But I think this sort of aspects of antiphony, even though there are good arguments why this may be to do with sexual selection and so forth, do suggest that such singing is of very considerable importance. And what very much intrigued my thinking in this area was this paper by Gray et al. In Science in 2002, where they were talking about animal music. And in particular, they were talking about not only the humpback whales and the birds, but also a number of other animals also sing, including the bird I just mentioned. And they said, well, the reason why these things are so interesting is because they're convergent. Now, the convergence you can explain, and I think perfectly reasonably, and again, those of you who deal with these areas in terms of professional philosophy, which I don't, I would never pretend to, could always say there are levels of explanation. I think this might be such a good example. That singing can be explained simply in the vibration of air columns and all the normal things. But the convergence includes such things as melody and harmony, inversion, and the sorts of things which we recognise as music and can actually enjoy listening to. So it's not just a cacophony to our ears. And she said, well, suppose we look at this as a slightly different way and say, well, imagine there's a universal music, quote, out there. The reason you have the same sort of music is simply because you're all tapping to the same sort of music which has existed forever, or discuss, and you'll understand, of course, the resonance in terms of Platonic thinking in that regard, which has been very influential in mathematics and also science. And that, to my way of thinking, I find extremely intriguing, but I also think it gives us a hint as to how we might now begin to explain consciousness. Because, famously, the question which Francis Crick, amongst others, cut his teeth on, and I think it would be agreed by just about everybody, comprehensively failed, but that tells you nothing about the genius of Francis Crick. It just tells you about the sheer problem of understanding what is it which makes us conscious. And that's the thing which I just want to dwell on very briefly now, and I can't remember what my next slide was in that area. Yeah, no, I don't need to worry about that. We'll go back. Yeah. This is really why I want to try and sort of make you feel, if not uneasy, at least get you to disagree with me, because what I'm going to suggest is completely bonkers. It has to be. But there are, of course, people here, no doubt, and certainly outside, who just don't think there's a problem. I mean, I think it's fair to say that Daniel Dennett, in particular, just says, well, it's just, just that sort of thing. It doesn't really matter, whatever. But I think it is profoundly important, and I think we just have not got the first glimmerings as to how we understand why we have qualia, if you like, but all the other things we associate with consciousness. And I, at least, if you're listening to a piece of music, reading a piece of poetry, reading some literature and so forth, in a certain sense, you're immersed in a separate world. You don't have any particular trouble justifying what you're doing to anybody else, because most probably they're enjoying that shared experience one time or another. But if you actually try and stand back and, as I really hinted, and say you have your dog beside you, you can't share the dog a book, so can you understand this sort of thing. So when exactly did this transformation happen? That's geologically even a little bit uncertain. One guess is probably about 300,000 years ago, perhaps. But what exactly is it which allows us to have the minds which we do? Now, in essence, the first thing, sorry, I have to refer to my notes here because it's not exactly new territory, but one which I'm only thinking about at the moment, is I think we can show beyond reasonable doubt that consciousness, if you like, sentience, intelligence, all these things bundled together, are not an evolutionary fluke. In other words, they have evolved many times. Probably more times than in fact we realise. So that in its own way I think is encouraging to know, and again it goes against the standard neo-Darwinian argument about it being an absolute fluke. Therefore I'd argue that it's evolutionary inevitable. If it's inevitable here, it ought to be inevitable everywhere else. Possibly so. But I think there's a nice irony. If this is correct with regard to our dolphins and our New Caledonian crows and those sorts of things, this doesn't help us one iota in explaining what this consciousness actually is. In some ways it makes the problem more severe. Now, of course, we can't talk to these animals, and we can do various experiments with them and other such as attempts to understand their cognitive landscape, but interviewing is still not possible. I'm not saying that's impossible in the future. But despite that handicap, if you like, that gives us no further clue as to what it is which makes us conscious. And it seems to me that there are very crudely indeed, three possible explanations here. I'm sure there are more, but these are the three which come instantly to my mind. The first is that, and this is the most appealing to a scientist in a way, and the famous analogy is the brain secretes thought in the same way as a gallbladder secretes bile. It's just the thing it does, it makes mind, and mind is that. And I think it's fair to say that Mary Midgley would broadly subscribe to that view, and I have enormous respect for Midgley. She's an incredible philosopher. But I don't buy it for a moment, for reasons which I'll try and explain in just a moment. But you can just say it's just an accident. I have a liver, I have a brain. One does one does the other, possibly so. Another one which is actually coming slightly back into fashion is to go back to very ancient ideas which involve what's called panpsychism, which will be, I'm sure, more familiar to most of you as trained theologians, philosophers and thinkers than I am. And of course this is a very intriguing thought, because you say, yeah, dolphin, all right, lizard, maybe, frog, amoeba, bacterium, stone. Where exactly does your consciousness end? Now there is a possibility they're right. I don't think they are, as it happens, for reasons I'll come on to in a moment, which are metaphysical arguments. But even so, it would be an interesting thought that, in a sense, consciousness is sort of embedded in everything. And so in that way, we shouldn't be terribly surprised that it becomes emergent and actually speaks, in the end, from very deep-rooted system. Quite what that deep-rooted system might be, I don't know. But even so, panpsychism is an attractive idea and quite seductive, especially if you want to be a pagan, perhaps. That would be very useful, perhaps. My view on it actually is very much the reverse, and it is, and let me say, I can't run the slides, not no, we'll skip that guy. Let's go on to another one. Come on, have a shot. My view is that, my view is, God, that's a pompous way of putting it. My tentative thought is that if we imagine the brain as being more like, and this is an awful analogy to use, but effectively an antenna. In other words, it is finding alternative, and I don't mean alternative in as much as we have a choice, but other realities. That then has some slight bearing perhaps on, amongst other things, music, but possibly also, as I would argue here, our religious instincts. I mean that in the very broadest sense rather than a specific credo, which I can come on to in just a moment. So if that is the case, then that is a hint, and I struggle to put this concisely, that the visible world around us, although of course in many ways it's extremely tangible, and you don't need Johnson to remind you how important it is. I'm not trying to be solipsistic about this. If you fall out of a building, you're killed. You don't sort of go into an alternative world and then come back again. But even so, there is, I think, the hint that there are other aspects about our reality which we have only, at least scientifically, the vaguest glimmerings of. Now, of course, you'll see immediately how that resonates with much religious thinking. And you will also see that if one was, and there may well be hard-headed materialists here who think this set of ideas is complete rubbish, they may think this is just an excursion into madness, and so it may be. But we do have the tangible difficulty of explaining what it is which actually makes us conscious in that sort of respect. And it does seem to me, if there are not tests about this, there are at least aspects which resonate with the way that we see things. And one of them, of course, is in terms of mathematics, and again, the sort of Neoplatonic program, where there really is a mathematics out there which we discover, rather than something which we invent in our own minds. And if that is the case, and some mathematicians subscribe to this, Roger Penrose, perhaps most famously, I'm told other mathematicians don't. They regard the thing as effectively a series of internal constructs. But even so, that's an aspect which very much is referred to by the mathematicians. There's also just a whole question, even encapsulated in this lovely photograph, this museum in Rome, from a postcard. I can't take photographs like that, I can assure you, of where our imagination comes from. What is it which allows us to think through things, even as humble scientists in biology, let alone the people who are dealing with deep questions of cosmology and these sort of areas. How exactly is it we construct these things inside our mind, ostensibly, as it's argued, I think it's complete rubbish, but ostensibly on a Pleistocene background. And it also has a bearing, of course, on exactly what it is which allows us to be human. What is our sort of underpinnings in that particular respect? When did we make that transition? And here I'm very influenced by the ideas, which I wouldn't claim to understand in their fullness at all, but the ideas of Owen Barfield with respect to the origins of poetry and language. Barfield, as you'll know, one of the Inklings, great friend of Lewis and Tolkien's. Arguments in part were to do with that language wasn't something which was sort of evolved from a series of grunts, which slowly emerged in terms of a syntax and the semantics associated with it to provide the meaning. But in point of fact, language was something in this sense is almost pre-existent. And one has words which at one stage could explain almost everything. So a word like fire, for instance, which we now disassociate into one specific meaning, actually covered almost a multitude of meanings. And the so-called idea of the splintered light, the fracturing of our language, has led to an increased precision, especially of scientific thought, but at the same time has destroyed much of our mythological underpinnings. And by mythological underpinnings, I mean utter realities, analogous to those which are associated with mathematics. These aren't simply wish fulfillments, for example. So that too is, I think, a hint that the way in which our consciousness actually taps into other things is the real possibility that we might have new realities to explore. And that, of course, will resonate, at least with some people who subscribe to various religious traditions, Christianity being my own, but by no means excluding that, whereby almost invariably such alternative realities are taken almost for granted. But of course these days, partly from the onslaught of the materialists, and especially in biology, have been regarded as effectively ones which are negligible. They're just sort of fairy stories and things like that. And I was very struck, Tom Wright, who I'm a great fan of in many respects. I enjoy his writings, and many of you would have probably read already his latest book. He probably writes too much now, don't tell him that, but I don't know him personally, but I mean, despite all that, he's always engaging, and his sort of successor to C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity, I think it's called Simply Christian. There, what strikes me as most strongly in that book, which I warmly recommend if you've not had the time to look at it, is effectively the engagement with other realities, what would be sometimes called the supernatural, or whatever you want to call it. I think even that's not necessarily the best of terms. But the idea that there is much more to our world than we might possibly imagine, and I can think of much other evidence to support that. Now, it seems to me, just to conclude, I've got 30 seconds to go, jolly good, is to begin with, if that is correct in some sense, although scientifically it will probably seem absolutely barking, then one part of the discussion about, oh dear, don't we live in a big universe? Hasn't it been going on for so long? Isn't it so many, trillions of this and billions of that and so forth? It may turn out, in fact I'm pretty sure it will turn out to be, actually that's more or less a backdrop to start with, but more importantly there will probably be interior worlds as we now perceive them, which are far richer, far more diverse, far larger than anything which we had otherwise admire in the heavens. So that's one possibility. The other possibility is, in a certain sense, it's not a scientific test, but we do know perfectly well there is one instance of a person who left this world, came back to this world, and then left again. And of course you know perfectly well who I'm talking about, so I'll finish there. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you, Simon, very much, and thank you for leaving a good time for questions and discussion. And it's over to you for the first question. That hasn't provoked a lot. Yes.
I can't sort of cope with all that stuff towards the end, but a question that I'm glad to have a chance to put to you, may be able to comment on. If it's true that the sun is overall heating up, is there any evidence to disprove the idea that life could have evolved on Venus and then moved here?
Oh, that's a perfectly fair question, and in fact it's more likely to be evolved on Mars than on Venus.
That's what I used to say until I heard that it was warming up, though.
Oh, it is. I mean, all the planets have the similar dilemma in as much as the solar luminosity is increasing. We have a homeostatic system which is probably largely governed by biological feedback, so I don't subscribe to Gaia's hypothesis through Lovelock, but nevertheless there are homeostasis in terms of mediating carbon dioxide, especially as a greenhouse gas, which are extremely important for the well-being of the planet. And I'm not thinking just of global warming. Early in the history of the Earth, and there are various escape clauses, it's very difficult to get the Earth warm enough. And the standard argument is you have a high methane atmosphere, which increases the surface temperatures. It may not have been. I have a colleague has got some very clever ideas of alternative chemistries at that time. At that time, Mars wouldn't possibly have been habitable. It may have had a fairly high carbon dioxide thing. Getting material off Mars during early impacts is relatively easy because it's a fairly small planet. Getting them inwards is much easier than getting them outwards. But it doesn't really matter terribly whether Venus or Mars were our originators. The more important point, perhaps, which I'm not sure is where your question wants to go, but is something which intrigues me, again, is, you know, these sorts of things, and especially in Christianity, not only do you have I'm not saying for a moment you want to subscribe to these, but nevertheless, those people who do subscribe to them have a series of ideas which are completely lunatic, apparently. And one of them, of course, is to do with the fact that things will not go on forever. That's fine and large. When we look at the future of the history of the Earth, one suggests, or the present climate modelling suggests, that we have roughly 800 million years left. Roughly. It's a complex thing. There are various models on this. Most people say 5 billion years. But in point about, as the solar luminosity increases, this planet will become uninhabitable in a geological time. So, now, all that may happen. I mean, you know, who knows? But the fact of the matter is, sooner or later, you end up with a series of claims, in particular, which are orthogonal to how we think things will go in the future. And there are various escape clauses to suggest we should be more cautious. And I don't talk about that here. I'll probably rattle the people on the summit call. In fact, I think I will, because that leads to mass panic as well. And I'm sure with Simon Mitten will tell me immediately this is total rubbish. You, Simon, but if you even think about the Big Bang in particular, okay, and that seems to be an instantiation roughly 13.7 billion years ago. The assumption, of course, is not only is the thing accelerating, but it will, quote, go on forever. And indeed, we have these gloomy things that in 10 to the 30 years, you know, the protons begin to decay, and it'll be this sort of vague soup of extremely cold particles, and be absolute hell. And there may even be people there who are going to see it, though I don't think they should be told about that quite yet. There are, however, other possibilities, and it may be that in those equations which produce the Big Bang, for want of a better word, there are other equations which suggest that you go into another phase change at a certain point, and then maybe everything will change. And if we don't understand the origins of the Big Bang, I wouldn't be too sure we can understand what it will eventually lead to. So though the general idea is it will continue to unravel forever, it may be one goes into some other condition whereby things are completely altered. Whether that's got any bearing on this, of course, is another question. I'm very wary of introducing science to try and explain religious instincts, but I do firmly believe that there are truths on both sides, and sooner or later they're going to be reconciled. So I've taken you a little bit away from Venus, but nevertheless, it's a relevant point. Philip.
Simon, what's brilliant about your talk is it invites a partnership between scientists, philosophers, theologians, which we rarely get, that sort of invitation. So might I take you up on that and say, on the comments at the end, which rather than seeming strange or crazy to us, bring us back to our home turf, if I give 4 models in half a sentence each, which would you say that the evidence that you work in best supports, right? Plato, eternal forms, not rooted in the mind of God, just there in some realm, and their we participate in them and therefore have access. So that's, and we see them then incarnated, as it were, in the biosphere. Augustine, same forms, now located in the mind of God, argues it makes more sense that through the willing of a personal like being, that they're made accessible to us. Right? Two other models, however, Plotinus, there's a one which is a source of all, with sort of infinite complexity but only potential, and that sort of emanates outward, and it's this process of gradual emanation that leads to our having the sorts of capacities we have, intellectual, spiritual, and so forth. And finally, the sort of Plotinus turned on his head, the emergence theory that says there's a movement upward, lured perhaps by God at the end or from the origin or whatever, but emergence from a world which is at one point purely physical and one point purely chemical and primitive biological and so forth. That last one might tie in with a sort of view of progressive revelation, which at least in Protestant theology is, and in some forms of Catholic theology is attractive. So just four quick models. Which is there any way that you can even sort of say a scientist closer, not closer, helpful, not helpful?
I mean, you're an expert in areas which I've only dabbled in, but I mean, and of course there's overlap between them. I mean, to the first approximation, I think I know partly why you asked the question. I have no quarrel with that at all. It would be with Plotinus in that sort of sense. What I am myself very wary, well, two things I'm wary about, but as a complete amateur. The first is the sort of the progressive arguments in a way, although they're very appealing because it seems to make the understanding of organic evolution more easy to reconcile. I think, in point of fact, a great deal of, I'm not expressing myself clearly, many valuable things are jettisoned at that stage, and I think, in fact, one will find that jettisoning leaves one too exposed to other ways of interpreting the data, which I think in themselves will turn out to be wrong. So I am wary about the last one. Although I think it'd be fair to say you probably have more sympathy with that area. I'm not trying to put you on the spot now, but than the others. But the other aspect again is that so far as one sort of has an and I'm not in any sort of expert, but so far as one has an appreciation of Islam, it is that they, I think, it'd be fair to say, take God completely seriously. And I think one of our risks has been, in the sense that because of the success of the natural sciences, is, if you like, not so much to dilute it, but somehow to imagine, this guy's a sort of partner. He's a professor in the block. And I think that's partly why creation scientists are attractive to particularly Western scientists of one sort and another, because in the end it's an engineering analogy, and that's where I have part of my argument with it. Whereas if one then stands back and says, those things which happen are completely other, completely different, and famously are completely incomprehensible in one way, then I think actually, although that sounds like a defeatist argument to a materialist, I think in a way we should just be a little bit more humble about imagining it. It does happen, it did happen, but I think sometimes we tend to dilute that too much. So that would be a very quick response. But thank you.
You've used the word intelligence to describe a number of different things. Tool making, language, ability to respond to music, ability to think religiously. So is intelligence, in your view, one thing which just has a series of different aspects or properties, or are these different sorts of things?
Gosh, I think they are. I think they are the same thing, because I think in the end, what one is really, going back to Philip's question, is what one's trying to grapple with is that there are realities, any one of which can be approached from a different avenue, but each time, and that's, I'm not a mystic at all, no danger of that, that's for sure, but when one's trying to grapple, those people are writing in that way, as ever, one's entering what appears to be a fog, but it's a fog with a complete structure to it, and it's very, at least from my perspective, very difficult to articulate. And if you achieve it through music, that's fine. If you achieve it through tool making, we could call that pottery if you prefer, that's fine. But I think in the end, any one of them is an avenue to something beyond, and with the arguments, especially in Christian theology, to do with the end of the universe and the resurrection, general or otherwise, is that at that time, as has been suggested by many, many people, first of all, I think we'll be amazed at just how blind and stupid we were, but there we go, that's apparently, there's an escape clause, I've been told. But more importantly, that new world will be so much better. Of course, that's the standard way preachers proceed, but will be so much more interesting, so much more wonderful, and also may well be infinite. It won't necessarily be, oh, well, that's all right, jolly good. I mean, I have suggested I'm afraid, somewhat heretically. It may well be that you may be no more certain about a whole lot of things, including the divinity of Jesus then, than you are on the other side of the grave. I don't know, but I wouldn't take it for granted. Because this idea of going to sit around saying, well, it's a jolly nice universe we've ended up in, and I think that's not what we're meant to be here for. But I'm sorry, it's a very quick answer to a very important question.
Yes.
Thank you. I must confess, I'm still struggling to understand your fundamental argument here, and it does get a bit more confusing when you end up putting up a slide of a well-known medieval forgery. I don't quite know.
That's genuine.
No, right. Okay. But broadly speaking, as I see your argument, and I'm particularly confused about this business of life on other planets, you seem to be saying consciousness and intelligence is inevitable, and you use these arguments of convergence, which I think we can all accept. So you say consciousness and intelligence is inevitable, and therefore it would develop naturally on other planets. That's point A. Point B is, where are they?
Quite. Yes.
And then point C is, what is point C? God exists?
No. There's no... Point C, you have complete freedom to decide what you want on that, in that respect. You can decide it's absolute rubbish, you can decide it's all explained in terms of simple, what we understand with present scientific materialism. Perfectly, I think I could mistake myself, but nevertheless, point C is open for each person to make their own decision. Point B, which I think you have a very fair point, if I understand it correctly, is effectively the Fermi paradox. Where on earth are they?
I'm more interested to know whether you think they're going to turn up.
No, I don't think they are at all. No.
Why don't you think?
For a whole set of reasons. I mean, the principal reason, which I think Fermi really subscribed to, is that we wouldn't be here to talk about it, because we have a whole lot of solar systems with 3 billion year head start. If I'm right about the convergence, then they would arrive sometime round about snowball Earth time. And if they're interested in other planets, maybe they're not, maybe they'll sit around doing poetry, there are various sort of arguments. There's this nice book by Stephen Webb called Where Are They?, where it's got 49 explanations, including that one. But I think that's extremely unlikely, as it so happens. I mean, there are another possibility you didn't think of. But that fact that we have no evidence at all of any sort of visitation, so I'm not talking about UFOs, whatever they are, goodness knows what they are, they're something strange, but they're not extraterrestrials, that's for sure. I'm pretty sure in any case. So far, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, okay, they are at an initial stage, but even so, quite a lot of listening's being done. There's now interest in the optical SETI program, and that I think was far more likely to succeed than the classic radio telescope program, which the SETI Institute has been working on very vigorously with the Allen telescope. But those things, again, scientifically, I think within 40 years we'll have an extremely good idea whether there really is anything there in terms of tangible planetary dwelling species. But that silence, I think, is something which is theologically just as interesting as scientifically. But I don't think there's anything there at all. There's loads of planets, sure. There's a graveyard.
Well, I'm still confused.
Oh, well.
That's a good. Yes, the question.
Is it conceivable that they are broadcasting, but we are not picking up their wavelength?
That's one of Webb's arguments. Yes, it is possible. The EM spectrum has certain virtues, certain windows, certain transparencies. We may not be listening in the right place, and indeed it is a big place and all the rest of it. But
the point is, now when you consider the physical life, not just the biology becomes a bit more, just the physical part of human life or any life. It's the radiation from the sun which organisms are appropriating, plant systems of increasing complexity. It's the same energy, but the way they actually fix it and utilize it, and subsequently animals utilize it, is different. And so when you talk about intelligence, it may be that there is the same spiritual, like the radiation, I'm using that analogy, there is the same spiritual force, the Spirit of God, and the way organisms appropriate is reflected in their increasing complexities and whatever convergence you are trying to draw.
We have 2 minutes on the tape, so just
Sure.
2-minute answer.
well, less I hope. No, I mean your point is perfectly sensible and perfectly serious, but I mean this at the moment is simply completely unexplored territory. And the more we, the less. I mean, there is one view, especially with animal intelligence, that says, sure, that's fine and large, that takes us a certain distance, but they're still definitely animals. That's beyond dispute. But they may have other aspects about them which are, not alien, but there just is not that same mental world. We may have inklings of it in dolphins and New Caledonian crows and all the rest. But as I say, well, if you look at our own history, you go back 2 million years or even more recently than that, I can't see what the difference is. whatever it was. I don't think it's anything sort of mysterious, but nevertheless, it's something which separates us now.
Well, I know that we have a lot more discussion, a lot more questions. It's 2 o'clock, we're going to stop now. And just thank Simon again for a really stimulating talk. Thank you very much.